My name is Penny Wrights, and I will be reading Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, thank you so much, Penny, and good morning, Chapel family. Welcome to the fourth and final Sunday of Advent. Wow. The word Advent just means arrival, and so for centuries, Christians around the world have marked the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas as a time to await the arrival of the Messiah. Some families use Advent calendars, so Advent candles. They light a candle each Sunday of Advent. Other families use Advent calendars, usually where you open up a little window and you eat the little piece of chocolate that's behind the window, right? Or in the really disappointing version that I once was given, you open up the window and you look at a little picture behind the window. I don't know who thought that one up, but it was just subpar. But there's this sense of countdown, there's this sense of anticipation and longing. Just like 2,000 years ago, the people of Israel just needed their Messiah to show up. We need Jesus to show up today just as much. So we have chosen for this Advent season at the chapel to really focus on the simple stories of Christmas. Because there's something about stories, right? They tend to impact us more deeply and stay with us longer than if we just hear facts given to us. For example, I could say to you, at Christmas time, you really should focus less on the gifts and decorations and focus more on the people. And that would be good advice, right? That would be a true fact that I'm saying to you. Or I could tell you the story of a reclusive person who lived high up in the hills above Whoville, named the Grinch, who was so annoyed by these overly happy people that one Christmas Eve he decided to teach them a lesson. And so he snuck down into their village and he stole all of their gifts and their decorations and even their food. And he loaded them all on his sled, which was pulled by a freakishly strong little dog named Max. And how he went back up into the mountains and waited. And how on Christmas morning, the people in Whoville woke up and they found all their stuff missing. But instead of raging in anger, they all joined together in the town square and they began to sing songs of gratitude and joy. And how the Grinch, when he looked down and saw them, how he was surprised and how he was taken aback and thought of something he hadn't before. Maybe Christmas, he said, doesn't come from a store. Maybe Christmas, perhaps, means a little bit more. And how his heart actually grew bigger at that moment, and how he went back down into the town jubilantly, and he gave back all their presents, and he got to join the Who's for their Christmas feast. And he himself, the Grinch, carved the roast beast. So what's more powerful, stating the fact or telling the story? The story's always better. And so for the first Sunday of Advent, we talked about the story of a promise made about 700 years before the arrival of Jesus. Then we told the story of a faithful girl named Mary. Last week, we talked about the story of a Savior born in Bethlehem. And so today, for the final Sunday of Advent, let's tell the story of the wisest men. In that scripture that Penny read, it says that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So who are these guys? The Greek word from the Greek New Testament for Magi is magoi. It's actually the word that we derive our English word magic from, not surprisingly. So this was a class of wise men that worked in the royal court of Persia, highly educated, especially in the study of the stars, astronomy, but also astrology, predicting the future. They would actually study the scriptures of different world religions to try to predict the future. So it's almost like a mashup between theology and astronomy and astrology. And these men, when they saw this odd star in the sky, somehow they knew it was going to lead them to the King of the Jews. And the obvious question is, how in the world did they conclude that from just seeing this star? So I have a theory that I've been convinced of for a few years. So the Magi were from the Persian Empire, modern-day Iran. And for a Jewish person who would have been reading the Gospel of Matthew shortly after this was written, just the mention of the Persian Empire would have brought back horrible memories of the history of your people. Because about 600 years earlier, it was not controlled by Persia yet. It was controlled by Babylon at the time. But they came into Jerusalem under King Nebuchadnezzar. They conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple of Jerusalem, very symbolic, knocked down the wall around the city, and they killed a lot of people, and they took a lot of captives, marched them about 900 miles east back to Babylon. Years later, Persia took over, and those captives who had been marched to Babylon, the next generations, were still there as captives in Persia. So for the Jewish person, the whole idea of the Persian Empire, it just brought back horrible memories of that dark period in their history. But a bright spot during that dark period was a young man named Daniel. Daniel was one of the Jewish exiles who had been carried off to Babylon. And now here's where it gets interesting. Look with me at Daniel chapter 2, verse 48. Then the king, this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all of its, what does it say? All of its wise, you know who that is, right? That's an earlier generation of the Magi. And so think about this. Not only did Daniel join the Magi and become a wise man, he was put in charge of all of the Magi. And so picture this faithful Hebrew man. We know from the book of Daniel, Daniel was always faithful to God, even as an exile, right? Faithful Hebrew man now influencing all of these Magi. Don't you think it's obvious that Daniel would have shared with them the prophecy of the coming Messiah? I mean, every faithful Jewish person, that was their great hope. I can't imagine that he didn't share that. And so my theory is that the prophecy of the Messiah's birth was passed from Daniel to the Magi, and then when Daniel was dead and gone, to the next generation of Magi, and so on and so on. And so when they saw this really odd star in the sky that their astronomical training told them shouldn't be there, they connected the dots. They said, we think we know what this is. To me, that's the most probable theory, and it reminds me that even at the darkest times, God is at work. That period in Israel's history was a dark time, and yet God was up to something, weaving history together, preparing for the arrival of the Messiah. And I don't know if there's maybe only a handful of you who need to hear this, but if you're going through a dark time in your life right now, and if it feels like God is just silent, that God is absent, he's not. He is up to things. He is weaving things in the background. Even if you can't see what those things are, trust him. He works in our darkest moments. So the Magi set out to follow the star, and as the story goes on, we learn some things about what true wisdom looks like. So here's the first thing. True wisdom acts courageously. It acts courageously. So they follow the star all the way to Jerusalem, right? They're not yet in Bethlehem where Jesus is. they come right to King Herod. Now, King Herod was one of the local kings over the region of Judea, part of the Roman Empire. And here's where the plot thickens. Verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So who is this guy? Who is King Herod? Well, he was a character. I mean, he was feared like any self-respecting Roman ruler was, right? He ruled brutally. But he also had a good amount of respect. He had a lot of political savvy. He knew how to garner favor with certain groups of people. He had actually been the driving force behind some really good famine relief projects in his kingdom. People appreciated that. He led the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So the Jewish population kind of had an appreciation for King Herod and what he brought. So there was very, very mixed feelings toward him. Toward the end of his life, though, he became ill, and in his sickness, they say he developed a paranoia, and that he was very protective, and that he would easily fly into fits of rage. So, picture this, these magi from a distant kingdom show up in Jerusalem. They come to King Herod, who, by the way, liked when people called him the king of the Jews. And the magi said to him, hey, we heard there's a new king of the Jews. Can you help us find him? And it says, Herod was disturbed. This is a reminder that Christmas marks the arrival of a new king on the scene. And this king is a threat to all other kings. In fact, after the death and resurrection of Christ, when the early church was beginning to grow in the Roman Empire felt threatened, and they arrested many Christians. And when they arrested them, and they were torturing them, they didn't say, renounce the teachings of Jesus. Say you don't really believe in the sayings of Christ. They didn't say that. They told them, say Caesar is your king. And by and large, the Christians said, I'm not going to say it. I worship King Jesus. And Rome would not tolerate that. And they put them to death by the thousands. So when the Magi came to Herod and they asked him about this new king, Herod is disturbed, and so here's where you can see his political machinations in his mind. He starts devising a plan, calls together the Jewish priests and the scribes, and he asks them, hey, when is that Messiah of yours? Where is that Messiah of yours supposed to be born, according to your scriptures? And they don't even hesitate. They open up the prophet Micah, which says that he'll be born in Bethlehem. And so Herod sends the Magi off to Bethlehem to find the Messiah, and he says, when you find him, come back and just let me know where he is, because I want to worship him too. So then they go off and they see Jesus, and then they have this dream that warns them, don't go back to Herod. And so all of a sudden they've got a decision to make, right? Because here's the king, Herod, saying, come back and see me. And here's God through the angel saying, don't go back and see him. And so they have to decide, do we obey Herod or do we obey God? And they make the decision to defy Herod and obey God. Gutsy decision. Godly wisdom makes us courageous. It empowers us and inspires us to do things that we would not ordinarily do. And sometimes that means we have to decide to obey God over some powerful figure in our lives. Anybody have a King Herod figure in your life? Someone who's exercises a lot of weight in your life, powerful personality. You tend to like to do what they want and please them. Maybe walk on some eggshells around them for fear of displeasing them. And sometimes what it means to have a godly wisdom is that you have the courage, because of your relationship with God, to say no to that person so you can say yes to God. I've always loved that quote, he who kneels before God can stand before any man. And isn't that what the Magi experienced? I mean, they knelt before God in the flesh, Jesus, and they got up from kneeling before him and they said no to King Herod. Maybe that's really important for you to hear today. True wisdom acts courageously. Secondly, true wisdom gives generously. Probably the thing that the Magi are best known for, right? Pick up the story in verse 9. After they'd heard the king, they went on their way. The star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshiped him, and then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Entire sermons have been preached on gold, frankincense, and myrrh. There's your 3 points, right? Point 1, gold. Point 2, frankincense. People have talked about this a lot, and they love to talk about the symbolic importance. Probably the most common theory that I've heard is that the gold represents the kingly status of Jesus, that he's a king, that the frankincense was an anointing oil they would use for priests, so it symbolized the priestly function that Jesus would play, bridging God and humanity, and that the myrrh was a known burial spice, so it was sort of prefiguring getting Jesus ready for his burial. All those things might be true. I don't know. It's all speculation. I think the main point is this. The Magi were responding to God's generous gift of Jesus by turning around and giving him something generous. I truly believe that the most powerful force in the universe is grace. It's grace. Grace simply means giving to someone who doesn't deserve, someone who hasn't earned it, simply because of love, just giving. And the Magi sensed that the arrival of Jesus was God's grace to them, right? They didn't deserve it. They didn't earn enough good behavior that finally the Messiah came to them. They realized it was all grace, and they responded to that grace by giving freely to Jesus. There's just nothing more beautiful, and sometimes you see it around Christmas more than ever. There's nothing more beautiful than generosity that's fueled by grace. A number of years ago was just a hard period of life for Norma Jean and me. We had just had our fourth child, and so there was all the stress that comes with that. We were in the midst of a home renovation in which anything that could go wrong went wrong. I mean, a lot of bad decisions were made, most of them by me. And it was just a tough time. And that was the time in life when I recognized the power of stress physically. I always knew stress, you could feel stressed emotionally. Man, I developed stomach problems. I was not doing well physically. Neither of us were sleeping. It was just one of those seasons of life. And we had all these bills that we couldn't pay. So it was right about that time that a woman from the chapel called me and she said, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I just sold a vacation home and I timed the market right. I made a lot of money and I'm trying to figure out what to do with the money. And I liked where this conversation was going. But of course, I said all the polite things like, oh no, I mean, I can't accept that from you. You can't do that. And she said, why not? What else am I going to do with it? At this point in my life, how much do you need? And I kind of, hemmed and hawed a little bit. And finally, I sort of awkwardly said an amount, which was the bills that we had outstanding. I won't say the amount, but it was a good amount of money. And the next day, she dropped off a check at my house for that amount. And I have to say, it was a strange, unsettling feeling. I mean, I got over it. But it was such a strange feeling because I didn't feel like I deserved, I didn't feel like I had done, even pastorally, like I had officiated a really difficult funeral for her family, or I had guided them through some crisis they were in. There was no thing that I felt like I had really kind of treated her family special. I just felt like I didn't really deserve it. And that was the whole point. It was grace. And it was a beautiful thing. And it was really energized by her having received the grace of God, because that was just what her life was all about. And she was responding to that by doing the same kind of thing for others that God had done for her. And in the years since then, as God has blessed my family in different ways, we've been able to extend grace to others. It's a powerful force when we're overwhelmed by grace to give it to others. And I am just struck by the giving of the wise men being spurred by the grace of God to them. And I'm always impressed with the Chapel family, especially this time of year. Just a few examples, because you hear them and sometimes you don't put them together. You guys gave hundreds of shoeboxes full of gifts for kids all around the world. I mean, the stacks of them in the lobby in the gym was just awesome. You might be aware that our food pantry helps about 30 families every week all through the year. But at Christmas time, we do this special collection of gift cards. So we were able to give really generous gift cards to all of those families, and the ones that had kids got extra gift cards. So they were really blessed around Christmas time. We started this thing, I think it was 2 years ago, that we started calling the public schools around the chapel and asking them if they had some families that were really struggling financially. And we were pleasantly surprised. The school, they're not allowed to tell us any names because they have to protect the anonymity of the people, but they're able to tell us, here's how many families are receiving help from the school, and here's how many kids it represents. So this year, we helped more families than we ever did before, 17 different families representing 34 kids. And we were able to give them really generous ShopRite, Walmart, Target gift cards. We don't sneak in a sermon, to them. We send a simple card that says, Merry Christmas from the chapel. And we think that just really represents Jesus well. And then, of course, Christmas Eve. We're going to be collecting toiletries and winter clothing for folks on the streets of Patterson. I just know this chapel family is going to be incredibly generous, like they always are at Christmas. Because when we encounter Jesus, and when we really get how little we deserve it, it just shifts something inside us. And so I would say this to those of you who aren't feeling that, right? For those of you who aren't feeling overwhelmed by God's grace at Christmas and who aren't feeling like, man, it just makes me want to be generous, would you just ask God to hit you over the head with that this Christmas? Like while you're singing Christmas carols, maybe when you're at the Christmas Eve service and you're holding your candle up and you're singing, or maybe with your family when you're hopefully reading the Christmas story before Christmas dinner, ask God to just break through to your heart and overwhelm you with his grace. Just make you undone with his grace. And then out of that gratitude, respond in generosity, however God leads you to do, just like the Magi did. One more thing, and this is the most important. True wisdom worships Jesus. True wisdom worships Jesus. You can tell from the start that the reason the Magi would do, this was kind of a crazy journey, 900 miles. We don't know if they used camels, if they walked the whole way. The reason they would do something so bold, this was not an academic field trip. This was not, a curiosity journey. They said straight up to King Herod, we've come to worship this new king. Just like us, they were natural-born worshipers. Every human is a natural-born worshiper. The problem is, the challenge is so often we settle for something less than the real thing when we worship, right? So, people pack sports stadiums to worship their team. People pack political rallies to worship their candidate, right? I mean, that's true, that's worship. It's putting your deepest affection and love and trust in something or someone. They worship, their car or their home. Probably the most common in our culture, they worship their partner, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their spouse. I think in our culture today, worshiping romantic love is probably in the lead when it comes to misplaced worship, right? The way we almost deify our partner. I'm so grateful for my wife of 33 and a half years. She's an awesome wife, but I better not worship her. She better not worship me. Right? Because when you do that, one of two things is going to happen. That other person's going to really disappoint you, or they're going to die, or you're going to die first. I'm actually officiating a wedding later this afternoon, and let me just put your mind at ease. I don't say this at weddings. I'm not like, you will severely disappoint each other and then die. You may now kiss the bride. Going to spoil the whole vibe. But it's true, isn't it? When we put our deepest hope in a person, we're putting it where it doesn't belong. We're natural-born worshipers. Augustine, back in the 4th century AD, said, you have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Right? That was the Magi. Their hearts were restless. Like, man, we got to worship this newborn king. And they'd seen a lot of things in their lives. They had never seen anything like this. And so they bowed down and worshiped Jesus. Historically, this was an epic moment. Because remember, in the big picture of things, 600 years earlier, armies from the east had traveled 900 miles to Jerusalem to attack and conquer. Now, 600 years later, they traveled the same 900 miles, but now instead of swords, they carried gifts. And instead of forcing the Jewish people to bow down to them, they bowed before the King of the Jews. Whew. When they saw Jesus there, they were so overwhelmed with reverence, they just bowed down and worshiped. You ever think about how these guys, how this experience in their life must have changed them? All it says at the end of the passage is they went home to their own countries. But what happened after that? You may have heard me quote before, maybe my favorite Christmas poem, top 3 at least, is by T.S. Eliot. It's called The Journey of the Magi. And if you get a chance, it's not a long poem. If you get a chance just to download it, get it online, it's really good. It would create some great conversation. But at the very end of the poem, he has one of the Magi saying this: "We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods." Isn't that a fascinating thought? What happened? I mean, they went home to their country. Did they realize they didn't really fit there anymore? Because they saw all these people worshiping these idols, these pagan gods, and they had seen the real thing. Did they continue worshiping Jesus, even from far away? They have like a secret church going. We don't know. But here's what we do know. Wise men and wise women still worship him. In fact, it's so interesting. This is at the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, right? Matthew chapter 2. If you go to the end of Matthew's gospel, the last chapter, Jesus is all grown up. He's lived the most amazing life anybody's ever lived. He's gone to the cross to pay for the sins of the world. On the 3rd day, he's risen again. And about 40 days after the resurrection, we read this, Matthew 28, verse 16, very end of the book. "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, what does it say? They worshiped him, just like the Magi had done 33 years earlier, because they realized, even more so now, post-resurrection, they were in the presence of royalty and of deity. And the only thing that made sense is just to worship him. And so I'm so glad we're concluding the Advent series on this, because I have to ask you, are you trying to satisfy that craving, that human craving to worship, by settling for something less than the risen Christ? And if you're about to say, no, I'm not really into worship, we all worship. It's not a question of if, it's a question of what. Where do we direct our worship? And if you are worshiping anything or anyone less than the risen Jesus Christ, it won't last. It won't work. It might feel like it works for a while, but it won't work long term. And so maybe this Christmas, maybe it's time, in light of everything God has spoken to you, maybe it's time to let go of that lesser object of worship, or maybe just hold it a lot more loosely. And since we're only a week before Christmas, I'll say this: be careful about worshiping the traditions of Christmas, because you can do that too, you know. And I mean, believe me, yesterday, it was a little late, but I put the lights on our tree. I mean, I love the traditions of Christmas. I love eggnog. I actually love fruitcake. It's really good. Christmas socks. I mean, the whole deal, the presents, the whole deal. I love it. But I can promise you this: in a couple of weeks, that Christmas tree of yours is going to get dragged out to a muddy, rainy curb. Careful of the needles. And some of you are going, nope, not me. We use an artificial tree. Well, that's even more depressing. Whatever you have in a few weeks, it's all going to be packed up, everything back in the boxes, up in the attic. The only cookies left will be the rejects nobody wanted, right? Everything will be packed away, but it's actually okay. Despite that siren, it's okay. Because the thing we need the most, the thing that all those traditions were pointing to, will still be with us. God with us, Emmanuel. He's the one your heart's looking for. Don't get caught up in the traditions, the symbols, the pointers. Let him point you to the real thing and find it, what you're really looking for in Christ. Look, he came for you on Christmas. He went to the cross for your sins. He is alive today for you. He offers the kind of wisdom that makes you courageous, the kind of wisdom that makes you generous, because you've finally figured out the only thing that's worth worshiping. So at Christmas and in the new year, let's bow before him. That's the source of true wisdom, and that's what the story of Christmas is all about.